So today's weapon lesson is on weapons. So we did this with World War I, and now we're going to do it with World War II, so we can compare the different types of weapons that were used. One thing you'll notice with your notes is I've asked you to pick 3 weapons used per topic. So we'll see air, land, sea, and tactics. I'm going to present a lot of different weapons here, so just pick 3 to do notes on, because otherwise you'll get really overwhelmed. I got overwhelmed in research because there are so many different types of weapons that I'm missing some weapons here, but I kind of picked the main ones that were used in each air, land, sea, and tactics, and so I'm going to pick that. Also know that I would like to see some of these on the flipped lessons that you're making with your battles, so I want you to figure out which one of the weapons I've talked about or tactics are used in the battle that you are researching, and you'll see probably multiple ones of them are. Okay, so we're first going to start with air weapons. So that means anything that goes into the air, anything that flies through the air, and you'll see some of these are kind of, they cross over, but these happened in the air, essentially. These weapons were used. So this is actually the first war that aircraft was used effectively. And when I say effectively, it was very destructive. World War I, we saw some aircraft, but it wasn't very targeted. The aircraft that we're going to be seeing in World War II can hit its target, can hit it very easily and do lots of damage. So we'll start with the bombers. Right? Every country had their own bomber, but I picked 3 of the most famous. There's probably like 10 of like really well-known bombers. And these were essentially quick-moving aircraft that could carry bombs in the aircraft and then drop them usually on cities. So the destruction that was done was sometimes just to troops, sometimes to whole cities. And you'll see in the B-29, it destroyed a whole city and killed hundreds of thousands, well, tens of thousands of people. Okay, so one that's very well known is the Japan's Zero. That's what they call it, the Zero. And these are known for the kamikaze type of activity they would do. So the Japan Zero was mainly out actually over water, and these kamikazes would take suicide missions essentially, and they would fly their plane straight into aircraft, causing that aircraft to explode. So this was essentially a kind of making the plane actually a bomb by flying straight into an aircraft and making it explode. These are seen a lot in Pearl Harbor, okay? And also all over the Pacific. The B-17 was called a flying fortress, and this flying fortress carried 4 double machine guns and 5 single ones, and it could protect, and then also to protect itself, but also could carry bombs, so it could drop them on cities. We've also got the B-29, which is called the Super Fortress. All of them had a nickname in addition to a number. And that could carry 20,000 pounds of bombs. So these are the ones that carried the atomic bomb, which we'll talk about later, which were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima and destroyed those cities. There's still effects of it today. All right, the next air weapon was actually used against these bombers. It's called anti-aircraft, so it's against aircraft. So weapons that could be launched from the ground to the sky to hit these bombers that were coming by. So it's a long range, essentially, sometimes missiles, sometimes rockets, that could shoot down aircraft from the ground. So shoot from the ground up to the sky and take out those bombers or other aircraft that were up there. And so missiles are a type of those. And missiles were unmanned aircraft, essentially, that could be launched by using the radio from a nearby aircraft you're going to launch it typically into another aircraft, but sometimes also onto a land target. The most famous one is the German V2, and it was 46 feet tall missile. It's a huge missile, okay? It weighed 28,000 pounds, but once it was sent out, once that radio signal sent it out, it couldn't be recalled. So once it was sent to its target, it couldn't be changed or adjusted. So the Germans are known for having a really powerful and effective missile. All right, the next, I put this into air, even though they often launched from air and they hit the ground. but were bombs. And so these bombs ranged from 30-pound bombs to 20,000-pound bombs with the atomic bomb. So we kind of listed them in order of their size. So you start with fragmentation bombs, which are only about 30 pounds, and they're used to target troops. So if aircraft was coming over, saw troops on the ground, they would drop this to kind of destroy a small infantry. You have incendiary bombs, and incendiary essentially means to catch on fire. So these bombs were used to essentially create fires and wipe out cities because it would light the whole city on fire. And this happened in major cities across Europe. And then the most famous bomb is the atomic bomb. And only 2 of these have ever been used in history, and they were used during World War II and essentially ended the war with Japan. And these are powered by the release of nuclear energy. The damage comes through the blast that they push out as they drop, the heat that comes from there, and then the radioactivity that's left later. So if you've seen the mushroom cloud that comes way up in the sky from a bomb, that's the atomic bomb. The radioactivity stays for months and years and leads to birth defects and long-term effects of people, while the blast and the heat typically would kill people instantly. The heat was so hot at the core that it actually would evaporate people, essentially. You'd be instantly turned to ash and evaporated in that moment. So the 2 that were used have very interesting nicknames. Little Boy, which was anything but little, ended up killing 140,000 people in a city called Hiroshima, Japan. And only a few days later, Fat Man, the other one, which was larger, killed 70,000 people in Nagasaki. So these numbers combine both short-term deaths and long-term deaths because of the radioactivity. So while they didn't kill that many on impact, long-term and short-term effects killed that many people. All right, next up we have land weapons. So weapons that are going to be used primarily on the land, to the land. All right, and probably the one we're used to in most battles are guns. And so there's, again, a variety of guns. Some guns I didn't list on here, but I picked kind of 4 categories to talk about. So most soldiers that are going to be fighting in infantry are going to carry semi-automatic weapons and a sidearm. So semi-automatic just means you don't have to reload the bullets every time. It's not going to automatically fire like a machine gun where you pull the trigger and it just keeps firing, but you don't have to reload the gun every time. And these are going to be more long range, but they'd also carry like a handgun, a sidearm, which were used kind of they weren't as good for long range, they're better for close up when there's a soldier right in your face, you can pull this out, right? Whereas World War I, you had the bayonets, so when you're close to someone, you could stab them with a bayonet. This is going to be a lot more effective at killing your enemy. We're still going to have machine guns in World War II, but they become much easier to use, much more efficient, and they're used primarily in larger types of vehicles, like tanks. They're going to be used on planes and in ships. Okay, but they developed something called the submachine gun, which can rapidly fire bullets like a machine gun, but this time it can be carried by hand. So paratroopers that are falling from the sky, they're parachuting from the sky, and people that are in guerrilla warfare, so just kind of hiding out and sneaking up on people, are going to be the ones who use submachine guns the most, and they're going to be a lot easier. Like, you can carry them. Like a machine gun, you'd have to kind of stay in one place and fire. Submachine guns are guns that you could carry with you and move from place to place. The bazooka is another weapon that comes around during this time, and this is huge, heavy, hard to carry. It's not very good at hitting its target per se, not as effective, but the force in which it launches would actually hit tanks and could actually, I say hurt tanks, but it could create hit the tank so that the tank could no longer function anymore. And so the tank then becomes useless. So you have to have good aim for this because it's not as efficient as some of the other guns, but it can do some damage to their the heavy tanks that are also used during this war. Then we have artillery. All right, this is guns. These are the big guns, okay? And I just picked two of them to talk about. We've got mortars, and mortars are essentially souped-up cannons that can actually go over obstacles. So you can actually kind of lean it up and launch it over hills, right? Whereas most of our other cannons before this are going to go just straight across. This can go over obstacles. Same with rockets. They can be launched. Over different obstacles, and they have a longer range than a typical gun. All right, I have a few more in land. And this war, landmines are going to be used a lot, and actually probably the most destructive weapon in the war. Landmines are essentially mines, explosions that are planted underneath the ground. So if someone walks on a landmine, it instantly explodes. It's like you're walking on a button that just tells the ground to explode. And so you can't tell where they are because they're buried. And it almost always resulted in instant death. And if it wasn't instant death, it was at least a loss of a leg if a soldier walked or ran over one. So there's almost no way you can come back to being a soldier after going over a landmine. So that's why it's called one of the most destructive weapons. Tanks are still going to be in this war. But this time they're faster, they're more reliable, they're easy to maneuver. So you can actually get around different obstacles that you have. And they're also easier to make. So we can create a lot more, the war effort could create a lot more of these in a quicker way, and they could be used a lot more effectively. The Germans have a famous one called the Panzer, and the US have a famous one called the Sherman. If you're interested, you can research those as part of your next assignment. All right. The next type of weapon we have are the sea weapons. So we know this war was fought a lot in the Pacific Ocean. So they're going to have to develop, well, they've developed weapons that they're going to use in the sea. So blimps have a resurgence, believe it or not, in this war. And actually, they get a lot better at their job. They're used to spot submarines, and they carry machine guns on them. So the U.S. is the country that uses this the most. They only have one shot down in the whole war, amazingly. And they're good at spotting and locating submarines so that these other ships can come attack. The largest type of ship that we have is the aircraft carrier. And obviously these carry airplanes, so airplanes can be launched off of these from the ocean. And is better equipped with all sorts of weapons. So if they have anti-aircraft weapons, so if someone's coming by, they can shoot them down. But they're larger than these other two, but primarily they're used to launch airplanes from within the ocean. Battleships are a bit smaller and a little more effective at their job of destroying. They provide anti-aircraft defense again. And they're able to help when troops are going from the sea to the land. We call this an amphibious landing, right? Because you're on the sea, but you're also on the land. And so battleships would kind of act as a backup. And so as the troops were trying to get on land, they would kind of provide these rockets and missiles and anti-aircraft to kind of launch over them, so the troops could then go through and get onto the land. So something like if you have Normandy, the Battle of Normandy, you're probably going to see a lot of these because that was an amphibious attack. Destroyers are, again, then a step down from battleships, and these are kind of the first in, do a little damage, and then get out. So they're there to find the enemy because they can maneuver without being seen as much. And find the warships and then hit them so that these larger ships could then come destroy them, essentially. So they kind of injure them so these other two can then come up behind them and finish the job. And then again, submarines, just like the Germans used last time, now there's going to be a lot more submarine warfare. And these are the most effective and destructive sea weapons. They use torpedoes to do their job. So these tiny, well, they're not really tiny, but these weapons, kind of missiles used underneath the ocean, shoot out and then would hit the bottom of these different battleships. Okay. All right, last board. This is a long video. I apologize. There's just a lot to cover. Okay. Our tactics, or the fighting techniques. What did different countries use to effectively win the war? They had a lot of weapons, but they had to good strategies to use. So the Germans are famous for their blitzkrieg, okay? And that translates as a lightning war. So it was a quick movement of troops, tanks, and air power to essentially support their army. So a lightning war, let's bring all of our support into one area and get them from air, from land, even sometimes from sea, not typically though, to support that army and to take over land. And it worked. The Germans took 5 countries in 9 months, okay? That's 5 countries in 9 months. That's a lot of countries. That included France, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Poland, okay? They also tried to use it against the British by air, and so they were constantly bombing British cities. And this is actually where the Keep Calm and Carry On logo and motto came from. The Queen released that as cities were constantly being bombed, but people had to keep calm and carry on with their lives. So if you've ever made a Keep Calm sign of any sort, you can thank World War II and Blitzkrieg for that. All right. The U.S. used a strategy called island hopping in the Pacific Ocean, and this was used to attack weaker islands in a random order. So they literally hopped from island to island. They skipped the well-defended ones and went from a weak island to a weak island. So they just defeated all those islands so that then those stronger islands didn't have anyone to back them up anymore. Okay? And that worked because the U.S. ends up being on the winning side of the war. And finally, total war. This was used by every country throughout the war. And essentially, it's a war with no rules. So you can use any weapon. You can attack any territory or people. So in this war is the first war to really target civilians or just the common people. So we talk about the Blitzkrieg. There were cities full of civilians that were targeted. No, not a lot strong military in those. But if we attack your people, we attack your country. We'll be able to attack anything. It was also a total war. I didn't write this down, but because everyone supported the war effort, you had to. You had to, couldn't use certain resources, or you had to only use a certain amount. Like in the United States, you could only use a certain amount of sugar, a certain amount of rubber. People were donating old newspapers to be recycled and help the war effort. They were asking people to loan their money to help the war effort. So total war because not only could it target anyone, but everyone helped out.